The night had settled like velvet across the valley, draping Redemption Springs in shadows and whispers, but there was no peace in the air. The chapel's bell, once a gentle call to prayer, was silent now, its steeple wreathed in flames that licked at the heavens. Smoke curled upward, turning the stars into blurred embers, as if heaven itself wept for what was being consumed. Townsfolk gathered in their nightclothes, voices hushed and fearful, children clutching their mothers while men rushed with buckets of water too small, too late against the roaring fire. Among them she appeared, Nahima, her long hair tangled with sparks, her eyes reflecting both the fury of the flames and the calm of a healer who had seen storms greater than this. She carried a girl limp in her arms, a child with golden hair, her breath faint but present, and the crowd's murmurs turned from relief to suspicion in an instant. "The Indian witch," someone whispered, and the word grew like poison, tightening hearts instead of loosening them. Sheriff Mitchell pushed through, his badge gleaming in firelight, but his authority trembled under the weight of superstition. On the ground, the preacher, Reverend Hammond, cradled his daughter, the very girl Nahima had saved. His grief twisted into hatred as he raised his eyes, filled not with gratitude, but with vengeance. The fire cracked, timbers groaned, the night itself seemed to lean closer to hear his words. "Seize her," he commanded, and hands closed on Nahima's arms, though she did not resist. Her dark eyes stayed steady, watching the chapel fall, as if in the burning she saw more than anyone else, visions of what was to come, a path of sorrow and healing entwined. The crowd surged, torn between fear and awe, and the moment became the fragile beginning of something far greater than a fire. The next day would carry whispers of dreams, of rivers poisoned by silver, of old grief disguised as righteous fury, of a rancher scarred by war who kept promises to the dead, and of a preacher's daughter who would soon risk everything to cross a forbidden threshold. But in that moment, as fire painted the sky, all that existed was the trembling line between destruction and salvation. Nahima, with her hands bound, carried within her a quiet strength, a warmth that even flames could not consume. It was the strength of love unspoken, of compassion healing even when despised, and of destinies about to collide beneath the restless western sky. If your heart beats a little faster with this beginning, if you feel the pull of the fire and the quiet, stubborn tenderness of healing love waiting to be born, stay close to this story. Leave a gentle like, share a thought in the comments, and subscribe so you will not lose the thread of these lives about to entwine. Together we walk into a tale of shadows and light, pain and tenderness, where love grows strongest at the edge of ruin. And so, as the embers of the chapel cooled, the true story of Nahima, Mason, Clara, and Lucas was only just beginning, ready to move softly into the next chapter, where dreams become warnings and hidden hearts begin to awaken. Morning light crept across the valley, as if hesitant to wake a town that had burned the night before. Redemption Springs stirred with uneasy silence, the charred ruins of the chapel still smouldering like the ghost of a prayer left unfinished. In the hush of dawn, Nahima knelt beside the stream that cut through the eastern edge of the settlement, her fingers dipping into the cool current as she rinsed the soil from freshly gathered roots. The water shimmered around her hands, catching the first pale beams of sunlight, and the sound of the stream was soft, steady, like a healing lullaby against the restless memories of fire. Her basket lay beside her, filled with herbs. Echinacea for fever, yarrow for wounds, willow bark for pain. She worked with the same careful patience her grandmother had taught her, each root and leaf touched with reverence, as though the earth itself whispered its secrets to her alone. She was the last of her line now, the final medicine woman of her scattered people. That thought pressed against her heart with both sorrow and strength. The chain of knowledge, handed down through generations, had reached her hands, and though she bore it alone, it was not a burden she would abandon. She remembered her grandmother's words, "Healing is more than herbs, it is the balance of spirit, of listening to what the wind and water already know." In the stillness of morning, she closed her eyes and breathed deeply, listening. The air was heavy with the scent of damp earth and distant smoke. The land seemed to murmur warnings, subtle but insistent, like the dreams that had troubled her nights. Dreams of fire, of a girl's frightened cry, of a man's weathered face between two worlds. Hoofbeats stirred the quiet, pulling her from her thoughts. She looked up to see Dr. Rebecca Sullivan approaching on horseback, her figure dignified yet weary. The widow physician dismounted with the ease of long practice, skirts brushing the grass as she moved. "Good morning, Nahima," she said softly, though her eyes carried the weight of a sleepless night. The two women had long shared a bond deeper than the town would ever understand. By daylight, they kept their distance for the sake of fragile reputations. In secret, they exchanged knowledge freely, one offering roots and prayers, the other scalpels and powders. It was an unspoken sisterhood, one stitched from necessity and a desire to heal beyond the limits of prejudice. The doctor's voice was low as she spoke of the miller boy, his fever refusing to break. Nahima listened, her hands already reaching for a pouch of dried leaves. "Steep this 3 times in boiling water," she instructed, her tone calm, almost tender. "By morning he will wake with strength again." Their eyes met, and in that moment the exchange was more than healer to physician. It was woman to woman, both weary, both determined to keep children alive in a world too often marked by grief. Dr. Sullivan's fingers lingered on the pouch, as though she drew comfort from the warmth of Nahima's presence. "Thank you," she whispered, and for a fleeting moment the mask of professionalism slipped, revealing gratitude deeper than words. When the doctor spoke of Reverend Hammond and his sermons, Nahima's hands stilled. She felt the sharp edge of his hatred long before his words spread through town. He was not like Reverend Johnson, the old man who had once led with gentleness. Hammond carried fire in his voice and grief in his heart, grief sharpened into blades pointed outward. Nahima did not flinch at the mention, but her dark eyes grew distant. She had seen such men before, zealous, desperate, unable to distinguish their own pain from the sins they claimed to fight. She only murmured, "The truth remains true, no matter who denies it. My medicines heal, and that is all that matters." After the doctor departed, Nahima lingered by the stream, the necklace at her throat warm against her skin. It was her grandmother's last gift, beads and bone carrying the memory of countless generations. She touched it gently, as if the spirit of her mother still hummed within it. The water ran over her fingertips, clear and steady, a small reminder that some things could still be pure in a world clouded by suspicion. Yet her heart was restless. The visions came again in fragments. the chapel aflame, a girl's golden hair tangled in ash, and a man's steady eyes watching from the shadows. She did not yet know his name, but her spirit recognized him. A man of two worlds, carrying wounds of his own. By the time the sun lifted fully, she rose with her basket, her path leading back toward her cabin. The wind whispered through the cottonwoods, and she knew with certainty that the days ahead would bring trials meant to test not only her healing hands, but her heart. She felt the threads of fate tightening, pulling her toward strangers and secrets, toward choices that would blur the line between duty and desire. Her pulse quickened, not with fear, but with a strange anticipation, as though love itself waited just beyond the horizon, hidden within the trials yet to come. And with that quiet, steady strength, Nahima walked on, carrying her basket of herbs as though it held not just medicine, but the promise of something greater, of hearts mended as surely as bodies, of healing that could reach even wounds carved by time and hatred. The morning air warmed, the hills glowed golden, and the story of Redemption Springs moved quietly from ashes into the stirring breath of what was still to unfold. Mason Thornton sat on the porch of his ranch house, the horizon stretching wide and endless before him, as though the earth itself breathed in long, weary sighs. The leather strap in his hands bore the marks of his careful work, yet his thoughts wandered far beyond the peace he was shaping. The ranch was quiet, except for the low murmur of cattle in the distance, the steady rhythm of cicadas singing in the grass, and the occasional whicker of a horse in the corral. To anyone passing by, Mason was only a rancher, a man of solitude, weathered and self-contained. But beneath the lines carved deep into his face lived stories no one in Redemption Springs fully knew. His long sleeves, buttoned to the wrist even in summer's heat, concealed scars that mapped his arms like rivers etched in old stone. They were remnants of fire and battle, of a time when he bore another name, Grey Wolf, a captain in the army who had once stood between two warring worlds. He had laid aside that uniform 15 years ago, exchanging war for cattle, and in doing so he had buried more than just a career. He had buried love, loss, promises whispered at a deathbed, and the silent vow to protect a daughter not of his blood, but of his heart. The sheriff's horse appeared in the distance, its gait familiar long before the rider's form came clear. Garrett Mitchell carried news rarely light, and Mason felt it settle on him even before the man swung down and removed his hat. They shared little talk, two men who understood each other in silence more than words. But what Mitchell carried that morning cut deeper than old scars. The new preacher was stirring trouble, his words aimed sharp and personal toward Nahima. Hammond had the town listening with sermons filled with fire, with fear, with poison disguised as piety. Mason's hands stilled over the leather, his chest tightening at the sheriff's quiet confession. The children who drank from the south well were falling ill, yet those healed by Nahima were recovering. And already Hammond whispered that it was witchcraft, a curse disguised as healing. Mason's jaw clenched, though his voice remained calm. He had known such hatred before. He had watched men twist grief into blades. Yet when the sheriff added that Hammond's fury seemed personal, old memories stirred like ashes caught in a sudden wind. He said nothing of the truth that weighed in his heart, the truth that Nahima was the daughter of Morning Star, the woman he had loved, the woman he had buried with his own trembling hands 15 years ago. To the town, she was only the Indian healer, tolerated at best. To Mason, she was the living echo of a promise unfulfilled. His wife's last breath had carried one plea: watch over her. Let her walk her path, but be near when the world turns cruel. For years he had kept that promise in shadows, sending quiet help when she needed it, never revealing himself. But shadows were no longer enough. He lifted his gaze to the mountains beyond, peaks that once belonged to her people, and something inside him shifted. The air tasted heavy, not just with the storm that threatened in the distance, but with the weight of destiny. The preacher's hatred, the town's fear, the sickness spreading like unseen fire, all of it pressed against Mason's vow. Distance had been his shield, but it was a shield that would soon shatter. As thunder rolled far away, Mason's thoughts drifted toward the girl he had never truly held as his own. He imagined Nahima by the stream, her hands moving with quiet grace over herbs and roots, her spirit strong though the world called her cursed. There was gentleness in her that reminded him painfully of her mother, a healing warmth that could calm storms even as it risked breaking her. His chest ached at the thought that she walked alone, her shoulders bearing the same silence he had carried for too long. The sheriff left him with warnings, with worries, but Mason lingered on the porch long after. His revolver lay in its case, his saddle ready, though he had not yet chosen to ride. The wind shifted, carrying with it the faint scent of rain, and with it came the certainty that silence would no longer be enough. Redemption Springs teetered between ruin and renewal, and at its fragile center stood Nahima, unaware of the secrets in his keeping. The cattle lowed, the lantern flame flickered as the day dimmed toward evening, and Mason rose from his chair, his body heavy, but his purpose clear. Healing came not only through herbs or hands. Sometimes it came through the breaking of silence, through the mending of a bond long hidden. He would not fail her mother's memory again. And as he saddled his horse, the first drops of rain darkened the dust at his feet, marking the beginning of a storm that would draw him, at last, from the edges of her life into the heart of it. The clouds swelled black and waiting. The horizon shuddered with lightning, and Mason rode out, carrying with him the weight of years and the quiet hope that love, whether long lost or newly found, could still heal even what war, fire, and grief had tried to destroy. Ahead, Nahima's path waited, and with it the moment when past and present would finally collide. Reverend Theodore Hammond knelt alone in the dim light of his quarters, his hands clasped so tightly that his knuckles whitened, lips moving in fervent prayer that sounded less like hope and more like a man fighting with his own ghosts. His Bible lay open on the table, though his eyes hardly saw the words anymore. Beside it sat a small portrait of his late wife Sarah and the two children, buried 15 years ago. The candlelight trembled against the glass, giving the illusion that their faces flickered, like spirits trapped between memory and flame. Hammond's voice broke as he whispered their names. He prayed not for peace, but for strength, for vengeance, for the will to drive out the darkness he was certain had stolen them from him. Clara, his only surviving child, stood quietly in the doorway. 16 and luminous in her simplicity, she carried her mother's gentle features, hair the color of wheat, eyes soft with kindness. And yet there was something new in her gaze, something questioning. She had heard his prayers night after night, words that grew sharper with each passing day, words that turned Nahima's name into a curse. Clara approached carefully, the hem of her white nightgown brushing against the floor. "Oh, Father," she said softly, "the people whisper of sickness, of children growing weak, but some are healing." He turned to her with a tight jaw, bitterness veiled in a father's tenderness. "They are deceived," he said. "That woman's remedies are snares, temptations that lead them from God's grace." But Clara remembered the miller boy running in the street, his cheeks flushed with new life after days of fever. She had seen mothers clutch Nahima's herbs as if they were blessings. The evidence unsettled her, pressing against her father's unyielding words. She lowered her eyes, hiding the spark of doubt that might betray her thoughts. Hammond reached out, resting heavy hands on her shoulders, his eyes searching hers with a desperation that revealed the fractures in his certainty. "Promise me," he whispered, "you will stay away from her. She wears the face of healing, but behind it is ruin." "I cannot lose you as I lost them." Clara nodded, though her heart whispered another truth. That curiosity, compassion, perhaps even destiny, was already drawing her toward the woman he so despised. When she returned to her small room that night, she lit no candle, allowing only the pale light of the moon to spill across her journal hidden beneath the mattress. In its pages she recorded what she had observed: the patterns of sickness spreading through town, the families who used water from the south well falling ill, while those with the north well remained untouched. She wrote of Nahima's herbs, of the quiet dignity with which the woman moved through suspicion, and of the longing Clara felt to understand the healing she glimpsed from afar. The ink smudged where her hands trembled, but still she wrote, each line a thread binding her closer to a truth she dared not yet speak aloud. That night her dreams mingled with the smoke of memory. She saw flames rising, a figure bound to a wooden cross, and the distant voice of her father crying out her name. She woke with her heart racing, unsure if it was warning or prophecy, but certain it was a path she would one day walk. At dawn she braided her hair with trembling hands, staring into the mirror until her own reflection seemed strange, a girl balanced between obedience and awakening. She thought of Nahima by the stream, fingers gentle in the water, and felt something inside her stir, a quiet hope that healing was not only for bodies, but for hearts weighed with grief. In another part of town, Hammond's hands still clutched the portrait of his lost family. He told himself he hated Nahima because she was dangerous, because she led the town astray. But deep within, his hatred was older, rooted in the memory of a healer who had knelt at his family's bedside 15 years ago, whispering prayers in a language he did not understand, pressing herbs against fevered lips that never recovered. His grief had found a name to blame, and it had carried him across miles to this frontier town. His sermons burned with fire, because if he ever allowed silence, he would hear the truth he could not bear, that perhaps it was not the healer's failure, but his own delay, his own blindness, that had stolen Sarah and the children. The storm outside broke with sudden rain, rattling against the window panes, filling the night with its restless rhythm. Clara sat awake in her narrow bed, the pages of her journal hidden once more, her mind restless. Her father's grief was heavy, but her heart told her another story, that healing came not through fire and judgment, but through gentleness, through understanding, through the courage to listen where others turned away. As lightning split the sky, she whispered a silent vow to herself, to seek truth, even if it meant walking where she was forbidden. And so, while Hammond clung tighter to his Bible and his grief, Clara clung to the quiet voice rising within her, the one urging her toward Nahima's cabin by the hills, toward secrets her father would call sin, but her heart would call salvation. It was a step that would change everything, binding her life to a path of love, healing, and choices that would ripple far beyond her own. And as dawn approached, the first threads of her destiny were already pulling her toward the forbidden door. Clara waited until the sun dipped low, painting the sky in hues of rose and lavender, before slipping away from the parsonage. Her shawl clung to her shoulders against the cooling air, and in her hands she carried a small bundle, a loaf of bread she had baked herself, and a jar of honey taken from her father's pantry. Each step she took down the narrow path toward the stream felt like a betrayal of the man who had raised her, yet her heart insisted it was not betrayal, but seeking. The world her father painted in sermons was sharp, divided between holy light and blackened shadow, but Clara had begun to see shades of another truth, softer, like dawn mist, carrying both sorrow and healing. The cabin appeared suddenly, nestled against the hillside, smoke curling gently from its chimney. Clara paused, clutching the bundle tighter, her breath quick with nerves. She had watched Nahima from afar many times, fascinated by the woman's poise, the quiet strength that made suspicion fall away from her like rain on stone. Tonight she came not to observe, but to step across the threshold of her own fear. As she hesitated, the door creaked open. Nahima stood framed in the glow of the firelight, her eyes calm, knowing, as though she had been waiting for this moment all along. "You should not be here, preacher's daughter," Nahima said, her voice low but not unkind. Clara flushed, stammering as she held out the bundle. "I brought something. For you. For all you have done for the children." Nahima studied her in silence, then stepped aside. "Come in. It is not good for you to linger at the witch's door." Clara crossed the threshold, the warmth of the cabin wrapping around her like a balm. Herbs hung drying from the rafters, jars lined the shelves, and the scent of mint and cedar filled the air, soothing her heart. It felt nothing like the dark place her father's sermons had conjured. Instead, it was alive, tender, healing. They sat together at the small table, Clara watching as Nahima poured steaming tea into clay cups. Her hands trembled as she asked the question that had burned within her. "Will you teach me?" The healer lifted her gaze, unreadable for a long moment, then set the cup before Clara. "Teach you what?" "Your medicine," Clara whispered, her voice soft but sure. "Your healing." Nahima's lips curved faintly, though sorrow shadowed her expression. "And what would your father say if he knew his daughter sought the knowledge of a witch?" Clara looked down at the steam rising between them. "He doesn't need to know, not yet. When he sees that it works, when he sees it is not evil but a different way of caring, perhaps he will understand." She raised her eyes again, blue meeting dark, hope meeting experience. Nahima regarded her carefully, as though weighing not the words but the heart behind them. Finally, she said, "If I were to teach you, it would not be easy. Healing is more than plants. It is listening to the water, to the wind, to the silence inside yourself. It is patience. It is sacrifice. Are you ready for such things?" Clara nodded, determination shining through her nervousness. Nahima sipped her tea, studying the girl who sat across from her, and for the first time in many years felt the possibility that her lineage might not end with her. The thought stirred something tender, fragile, yet warm, like the first green shoots after winter. "Return in 3 days," she said softly. "Bring a journal and bring an open heart. That is where learning begins." Clara's breath escaped in a rush of relief. "Thank you," she whispered, clutching the cup with both hands as though it were a blessing. The fire crackled, shadows danced across the walls, and for a moment the two of them sat in silence, an unlikely pair bound together by threads invisible but strong. Clara's heart swelled with something she did not yet name, a mixture of gratitude, wonder, and a quiet yearning for more than lessons of herbs. Outside, the night gathered, stars flickering like watchful eyes. The girl who had come trembling with fear now rose lighter, steadier, as though the air itself had offered her a healing touch. As Clara stepped back into the cool night, the shawl tight around her shoulders, she did not see the figure who lingered at the edge of the trees. Lucas Wolfrunner watched silently, the young Apache's eyes following her every move. He had seen her before, wandering by the stream, her golden hair catching the sunlight, her steps uncertain yet curious. Something in him stirred when he looked at her, a pull that defied caution, a fragile sense of kinship across the divide of blood and history. He remained hidden, letting her pass, but his heart beat quick with a knowledge he could not yet shape, that her path and his were already entwining. Clara's thoughts, however, were far away, carried like a flame she dared to cradle in her hands. Each step toward town carried the weight of secrecy, yet also the sweetness of possibility. She had crossed the line between what her father called forbidden and what her soul called necessary. And though she did not yet know the storms gathering in Redemption Springs, she knew she would return again and again, drawn to the quiet warmth of Nahima's firelight, and to the awakening within herself that whispered of love, of healing, of choices that would change her forever. The stars wheeled above, the hush of night broken only by the sound of crickets, and the story carried forward, soft as a prayer and strong as a vow, into the uncertain dawn waiting just ahead. The night after Clara's secret visit, the valley seemed unusually still, as though the land itself was holding its breath. Nahima sat by the window of her cabin, a candle flickering near her basket of herbs. The flame leaned gently whenever the wind whispered through the cracks in the walls, carrying scents of pine and rain-soaked soil. She was not surprised by Clara's request to learn. Something inside her had felt the girl's presence long before she knocked at the door. The spirit world often moved ahead of human steps, and in Clara's eyes she had glimpsed a hunger not for power, but for truth. Yet even with that spark of possibility, unease stirred within her. She knew the path of healing was never free from sacrifice, and the preacher's daughter was walking toward a storm she could not yet see. Nahima closed her eyes, and the visions came again, unbidden but insistent. Flames roaring high, her own body bound to a wooden cross, the sun searing her skin, while faces twisted with fear and hatred surrounded her. But woven through the terror was another thread, the steady gaze of a weathered man, his presence in the crowd like a root anchoring her spirit. She woke from the vision with her pulse racing, yet a strange calm steadied her. Dreams had always carried truths, and sometimes truths were not meant to be avoided, but endured. As dawn broke, Mason Thornton rode out across the fields, the reins held steady in hands marked by time and scars. His mind was restless, circling back to Nahima. He had stayed away too long, hiding behind his promise to her mother, Morning Star, that the girl should grow freely, untouched by his shadow. But watching the town turn its fear against her forced him to confront the hollowness of his silence. Protection from afar was no longer enough. He had seen soldiers destroy with rifles, he had seen men destroy with words, and he knew Hammond's voice, burning with grief and zeal, was as dangerous as any weapon. By mid-morning, Mason found himself at the sheriff's side. Garrett Mitchell stood near the south well, staring down into its depths with a face carved from worry. The water shimmered darkly, reflecting the sky, but when Dr. Sullivan joined them with her medical bag, her words cut deeper than the surface calm. The sickness traced back here to the very water families drank. A residue clung to her samples, metallic, bitter, like poison. "It comes from the mine," she said, her voice low but certain. "The runoff flows downhill, seeping into the well. The children who drink this water fall ill, while those at the north well remain untouched." Mason's jaw tightened as he listened, his eyes narrowing toward the silver operation stamped with Hammond's name. He had seen rivers choked with chemicals before, long ago in other territories. The signs were the same, always the same. Children sick, fish dying, land scarred. But truth was a fragile thing in a place already steeped in fear. Hammond dismissed the doctor's findings as lies, insisting the sickness was spiritual punishment brought by Nahima's presence. And the town, clinging to his sermons, looked at the healer with suspicion, even as her herbs eased their fevers. Mason stood silent at first, but silence became a weight too heavy to bear. "He's turning their eyes away from what poisons them," he muttered to Mitchell, his voice quiet yet hard. The sheriff nodded grimly, sharing the burden of a truth no one wanted to hear. That evening, clouds rolled low, heavy with the promise of rain. Nahima prepared her medicines in the warm glow of her hearth, mixing teas that smelled of mint, ginger, and earth, healing scents that filled the cabin like a lullaby for the soul. Clara returned, shawl wrapped tight, her journal clutched in her hands. Her cheeks were flushed from the cool air, but her eyes glimmered with eagerness. She spoke of patterns she had noticed, the sickness spreading house by house, always following the creek. Nahima listened carefully, pride softening her features. The girl's keen observation was more than curiosity, it was the beginning of wisdom. Yet with each word Clara spoke, the healer's heart grew heavier, for she knew what fire awaited if the girl's secret ever came to light. Lucas, Wolfrunner, appeared soon after, moving like a shadow along the trees until he stepped into the circle of firelight spilling from the door. His dark eyes rested on Clara, then on Nahima, carrying both concern and quiet affection. "The town gathers," he said simply. "Men with guns. I heard them speak of a ritual, a cleansing." Clara's face paled, but Nahima's expression remained calm, as though she had already known. "The visions are drawing near," she whispered. They sat together that night, Nahima, Clara, and Lucas, while the storm pressed closer, thunder echoing through the hills. The air inside the cabin was warm with fire, scented with herbs, a place of safety that felt almost like the center of the world. Nahima taught Clara how to grind willow bark for fever. Lucas watched silently, and for a brief moment the three of them seemed bound not by fear, but by quiet companionship. Healing was not only in the teas brewed or the roots gathered, it was in the warmth of shared silence, in the tender brush of hands passing a clay cup, in the way Clara's laughter, soft and uncertain, seemed to mend something even in Lucas's guarded heart. But outside, voices grew sharper, plans hardening. Reverend Hammond's grief burned into fury, and he prepared not for healing, but for judgment. The storm broke at last, rain sweeping the land in silver sheets, and with it came the knowledge that the fragile peace of Nahima's cabin would not last. The time of dreams was ending. The time of trial was beginning. And as lightning split the sky, Mason Thornton rode through the storm toward the woman he had watched from a distance too long, carrying not just his past, but the unspoken hope that perhaps, in standing beside her, he too might finally find a measure of healing. The storm rolled away with dawn, leaving the valley damp and restless, the earth breathing steam as sunlight broke through tattered clouds. Redemption Springs stirred with whispers, men gathering at the clearing on the edge of town where timber had been dragged and shaped into the rough frame of a cross. The smell of wet wood mingled with the acrid scent of smoke that still lingered from the chapel's ruins. Children peered from behind their mothers' skirts, eyes wide with both fear and fascination. The town was alive with expectation, not of prayer but of spectacle, its people drawn by the preacher's summons like moths to flame. Nahima walked between two men who gripped her arms, their hands rough on her skin, but she did not resist. Her steps were measured, her head held high, and her dark eyes swept the crowd not with anger, but with the quiet composure of someone who had already seen this moment in her dreams. She felt the damp earth beneath her feet, the smell of rain still clinging to the air, and she thought of her grandmother's words, that some visions are not meant to be escaped, but embraced, for they mark the path the spirit must walk. Around her the crowd muttered, voices rising with fear, suspicion, and the thrill of self-righteous judgment. Reverend Hammond stood at the front, his Bible raised in one hand, his face pale with sleeplessness and fervor. He looked both commanding and broken, the years of grief etched deeply into his brow, his eyes burning with a fire that was no longer holy but desperate. "Behold the witch who has brought sickness among us," he declared, his voice carrying over the field. "She poisoned our water, bewitched our children, and defied the house of God. Today we cleanse redemption's springs of her shadow." But even as his words thundered, ripples of unease spread through the crowd. Mothers remembered the fevers that had broken only after Nahima's teas. Fathers recalled the healing touch she had given when they were too proud to admit they sought it. Their eyes darted from Hammond's trembling hands to the calm dignity of the woman before them, and doubt whispered where certainty once ruled. Sheriff Mitchell stood near, revolver at his side, his jaw clenched. He had sworn the law would not become a lynch mob, yet the preacher's influence weighed heavy. His deputies shifted, uncertain, their loyalty torn between order and the town's hunger for spectacle. Mitchell's eyes met Nahima's briefly, and in that glance he saw neither fear nor plea, but a quiet strength that steadied even his own wavering resolve. Mason Thornton arrived at the edge of the gathering, his silver hair damp with rain, his presence cutting through the crowd with unspoken authority. He dismounted slowly, every movement deliberate, and walked forward until he stood between Hammond and the bound woman. His weathered face, carved by years of war and solitude, carried not rage, but a controlled, simmering determination. "This ends," he said, his voice deep and steady, not in fire and humiliation, but in truth. The preacher's eyes narrowed, recognition flashing as if he had seen a ghost. Mason's words rang like a hammer against stone when he spoke again. 15 years ago my wife, morning star of the White Mountain Apache, tried to save your family. She poured her strength into your wife and children when even the army doctor had given up. She wept when they died as if they were her own, and you repaid her by turning your grief into hatred. This woman you call witch is her daughter, Nahima. The blood of the healer you condemned flows in her veins." A stunned silence fell over the crowd, the air thick with revelation. Gasps broke from lips, whispers rippled like wind through grass, and all eyes shifted from the preacher to the healer, from Hammond's fury to Nahima's stillness. Clara pushed forward then, her face pale but determined, her golden hair damp with rain. She moved to stand near Mason, her voice trembling but clear. "Father," she pleaded, "you cannot do this. I have seen her medicine heal. I have seen children rise from fever when even Dr. Sullivan's knowledge failed. She is no witch. She is a healer." The preacher's mask cracked, grief spilling raw across his face. He staggered as though struck, the Bible slipping slightly in his grip. "Clara, you are deceived," he whispered hoarsely. "She wears kindness to lure you. The devil himself appears as an angel of light." But Clara did not retreat. Her eyes, filled with both tears and conviction, met his. Mother would not want this. She would not want hatred carried in her name. Healing is not evil, Father. Love is not sin. Nahima's gaze softened as she looked at the girl, a faint warmth rising in her chest. For the first time in many years, she felt not alone but seen, not as an outcast, but as someone whose spirit was recognized. She stepped forward, though her wrists were still bound, and her voice carried across the clearing with a calm that quieted the crowd more than Hammond's fire ever had. "The sickness does not come from me. It comes from the poisoned well. It comes from silver and greed leaching into your water. Look at the children who drank from the north well. They are well. Look at those I have treated. They are healing. Ask your own eyes, your own hearts, before you condemn mine." Her words, tender yet unwavering, settled over the gathering like rain over parched soil. Murmurs shifted, suspicion unraveling thread by thread. The sheriff stepped closer to her, his hand near his revolver, but his stance protective now, not hostile. Mason's eyes never left Hammond, steady and unyielding, the quiet force of a man who had carried guilt too long and now refused to let another carry hatred in its place. The preacher trembled, torn between the crowd's doubt and the fire of his grief. His voice faltered, the certainty that had once sustained him now slipping like sand through clenched fists. The wooden cross stood unfinished behind them, damp from the storm, a silent witness to a town caught between vengeance and healing. And in that fragile pause, as the people held their breath, the story shifted. The balance tilted, not by force, not by fury, but by the quiet courage of love, by the steady warmth of truth spoken with tenderness. Nahima's presence, Clara's defiance, Mason's revelation, Together they opened a path where fear began to loosen, and the possibility of healing, long buried, stirred awake in the hearts of all who listened. The storm had passed, but its echo lingered. The day stretched before them, uncertain yet alive with the fragile promise that the fire of hatred might, at last, give way to the softer light of understanding. And as the crowd waited, watching Hammond's trembling silence, Nahima knew the hour of trial was not yet over, but the seed of change had already been sown, ready to bloom even in the most scorched of soil. The sun crested the mountains, spilling gold over Redemption Springs, but the light did not chase away the heaviness in the air. The clearing where the cross still stood felt haunted, the damp wood glistening with dew like it wept for what almost happened. Townsfolk drifted back into their homes, shaken, whispering of what they had seen. The preacher faltering, the healer standing calm as stone, the rancher speaking truths long buried. For years, suspicion and sermons had bound their thoughts, but now doubt bloomed like wildflowers after rain, fragile yet persistent. Nahima walked slowly beside Mason as they left the clearing, her wrists rubbed raw from the ropes, but her spirit unbroken. The air smelled of wet sage, and each breath felt like a blessing after the suffocation of hatred. Mason's presence at her side steadied her, though he spoke little. She glanced at him once, seeing the weariness etched deep in his face, but also the gentleness he had tried to keep hidden from the world. The revelation that he had loved her mother, that he had been her silent guardian all these years, still rested in her chest like a stone and a comfort both. She wanted to ask him why he had kept the truth from her, why he had let her walk so long in loneliness, but the words would not form. The moment was not yet ready for answers. It was still tender, like new skin healing after a wound. Clara lingered behind them, Lucas close at her side, his protective glance never straying far from her. Her golden hair caught the light, and though she looked weary, there was a glow about her, as though courage had made her luminous. She carried her journal pressed tightly to her chest, every page now more than secret notes. It was witness, proof, a record of healing stronger than Hammond's sermons. Lucas spoke little, but when his hand brushed hers as they walked, Clara felt steadier, as though the world no longer rested solely on her small shoulders. Their quiet bond, still unspoken, was like spring water finding its way through stone, carving a path that would endure. By midday, the Miller house had become a sanctuary. Families filled its rooms, children lying pale but breathing easier as Nahima and Dr. Sullivan worked side by side. Herbs steeped in steaming pots mingled with the sharper scent of powders and tinctures, the room thick with the perfume of healing. Mothers sat close, holding their children's hands, watching fevers break, their relief spilling into whispered prayers that sounded different from the ones Hammond thundered. They sounded gentler, like gratitude. Mason stood by the doorway, his tall frame both sentinel and comfort, his grey eyes softening as he watched Nahima bend over each child with patience, her touch like balm. He saw Morning Star in her, the same dignity, the same fire hidden beneath calm, the same compassion that once made him believe love could mend even the worst of scars. For a moment he let himself remember the past, her mother's laughter, the warmth of her hands when they sat beneath the cottonwoods, the promise he had failed to keep when she died too soon. Regret pressed on him like a weight, but watching Nahima now eased something within. Perhaps he had not failed completely. Perhaps the healing he could not give to Morning Star he could still offer to her daughter, not through medicine, but through presence, through the love he had denied himself for too long. As the hours passed, word spread through town. People began to gather outside the Miller house, drawn not by Hammond's fiery words, but by the sight of children recovering, by the scent of teas, by the whispers that maybe, just maybe, the healer's hands were touched not by curses, but by grace. Hammond himself remained hidden, his voice silenced, his certainty cracked, alone in Dr. Sullivan's care. He battled not only with the truth of the poisoned well, but with the truth inside himself. That grief had blinded him, that his hatred had nearly destroyed the daughter he claimed to protect. Clara's refusal to bend had shaken him more than the rancher's accusations. His daughter's eyes, filled with kindness, had reflected a truth sharper than any sermon. Love heals more than fire ever can. As evening fell, lanterns glowed in the Miller home. The last of the sick children slept peacefully, fevers broken, their small chests rising and falling like soft prayers answered. Nahima stepped outside into the cool twilight, the scent of rain still lingering in the soil, the stars slowly emerging like blessings scattered across the dark. Mason followed, silent as always, but when she turned to face him, his hand lifted hesitantly, brushing a strand of damp hair from her cheek. The touch was fleeting, almost reverent, but it sent warmth spiraling through her chest, loosening the ache of years. His voice, low and rough, carried not command, but confession. "You're so much like her, stronger even. I should have come sooner." Nahima held his gaze, her eyes reflecting both pain and forgiveness. "You kept your promise, even from a distance. And now you are here." The words were simple, but they carried a tenderness that eased something deep inside him. For the first time in many years, Mason let himself breathe without the weight of regret pressing down. Clara and Lucas stood a little apart, their young faces lit by lantern glow. She leaned into him slightly, her voice soft as she spoke of what they might build after this. Truth spoken openly, healing passed hand to hand, a town remade not by fear, but by love. Lucas listened with quiet intensity, his hand steady against hers, and though neither spoke the word, it hung between them, warm and undeniable. The night stretched onward, not with the roar of fire, but with the hush of hope. The cross still stood in the clearing, unfinished, a reminder of what hatred had almost carved into their history. But in its shadow, something gentler bloomed. Healing had begun, not just in broken bodies, but in broken hearts. And as stars wheeled slowly overhead, Redemption Springs felt for the first time in many years as though it might truly live up to its name. If this story touched your heart, if you felt the warmth of healing love and the fragile beauty of hope rising from ashes, I invite you to stay with me on this journey. Leave a kind comment, share your thoughts, and subscribe so we can continue to walk together through tales of romance, tenderness, and the quiet power of love that heals even the deepest wounds. Your presence here means the story lives on.